The Saudi Trillions, Mali's Ruthven, in the London Review of Books is well worth a read in full. It made perfect sense that the first port of call on President Trump's first foreign trip in May was Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the world's second largest oil producer after Russia, the world's biggest military spender as a proportion of GDP, the main sponsor of Islamist fighting groups across Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and Iraq, the leader of a coalition in a devastating war against Yemeni rebels now in its third year, is a country one can do business with, even as the most ardent criminologists in the West struggle to understand it. It is a place often defined by its contradictions, in which tribal codes of desert and oasis, puritanical, patriarchal, frugal and austere, coexist and frequently clash with lavish displays of wealth and such emblems of modernity as air-conditioned shopping malls, designer boutiques and six-lane highways flashing with supercharged vehicles exclusively driven by men. Trump returned from his visit with a promise, he claimed, of a $350 billion in Saudi spending on American armaments over the next 10 years, with 110 billion US right away, of benefit particularly to Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon. The State Department celebrated the deal as supporting the long-term security of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region in the face of malign Iranian influence and Iranian-related threats. But in the last few months, we have seen a series of changes in the kingdom that make its future more unpredictable than ever. At the beginning of June, Saudi Arabia severed diplomatic ties with its neighbor Qatar, demanding that its Al Jazeera network be shut down. Then 2 weeks later, there was what appeared to be a palace coup. Since the death in 1953 of the modern kingdom's founder, Abdulaziz Al Saud, generally known as Ibn Saud, succession has passed down the line of his sons. The present King Salman, reportedly Ibn Saud's 25th son, inherited the throne in 2015 on the death of his half-brother Abdullah and is close to being the last of his generation. At 81, Salman is in fragile health. He has had 2 strokes and suffers from Alzheimer's. On 21st June, the doting king promoted his favorite son, the 31-year-old Prince Mohammed bin Salman, widely known by the initials MBS, to the position of Crown Prince, putting him in line to be the first of the third generation Ibn Saud's grandsons to occupy the throne. According to the New York Times, MBS's elevation at the expense of his older cousin, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, known as MBN, was the result of a well-executed plot. MBN was highly regarded by the US. On the night of June 20th, the eve of Eid al-Fitr festival that ends the holy month of Ramadan, MBN was summoned, along with other senior princes, for an audience with the king. Shortly before midnight, courtiers answering to MBS, who was already chief of the royal court as well as the world's youngest minister of defense, removed the phones and pressured him to relinquish his posts. MBN at first refused, but eventually gave in and now is said to be under palace arrest. As one commentator tweeted after the coup, bin Zayed has become the real ruler of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the 2 largest Arab countries. Congratulations to the people of these 2 countries. In this scenario, MBS, now abetted by Trump, appears as the useful idiot. Saudi Arabia has consistently accused the Houthis of being Iranian proxies, a charge that was once untrue, but which effectively had the force of a prediction, since as the war has ground on, Iran has stepped up its military aid to the rebels, partly to prevent total devastation. The Crown Prince engineered this dispute not to punish Qatar for its financing of terrorism, saying Saudi Arabia, it's a hypocritical comment coming from the Saudis whose own citizens have provided funding to radical extremists over the years, but rather to end Qatar's independent foreign policy, and especially its support for the Muslim Brotherhood and its ties with Iran. Simply put, the Saudis want to turn Qatar into a vassal state, as they had done with Bahrain, as part of their plan to establish Saudi hegemony over the entire Persian Gulf. We are a primary target for the Iranian regime, MBS said in May, shortly before Trump's visit, accusing the Iranians of seeking to take over Islamic holy sites in Saudi Arabia. We won't wait for the battle to be in Saudi Arabia. Instead, we'll work so that the battle is for them in Iran. London Stock Exchange, this is Saudi Aramco, in its desperation for the prize, has shown that it is perfectly prepared to bend the rules in Aramco's favour. Even so, a public listing at the level Saudi Arabia expects depends on the price of oil rising or at least not falling further. It also depends on the Saudis' oil reserves being quite as large as they claim. In the face of all this uncertainty, Nick Butler, an ex-BP executive, recently suggested in the Financial Times that Saudi Arabia's best option may be a private sale to China. The kingdom has more trivial money worries too. The Al Saud are a royal family like no other. There are thousands of them, descending from the 22 wives Ibn Saud had while technically observing the Sharia requirement of 4 wives max at any one time. He was father to the nation in more than a metaphorical sense. In the context of a tribal society, these prudential intermarriages had the benefit of binding together a number of different groups at a time when Ibn Saud was merely the head of a coalition of tribes who founded the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932 after he invaded the Hijaz. It's an extraordinary bill in detail in this article. In addition to the stipends, senior princes enrich themselves via off-budget programs that are widely viewed as sources of royal rake-offs. The largest of these, according to the cable, was thought to relate to the holy shrines of Mecca and Medina, around $5 billion annually, saying that Mecca is now largely Las Vegas, the site of Muhammad's first wife's house, where it is believed he received his first revelations and where 5 of his children were born, is now occupied by a row of public toilets. Then talking about surveillance, repression, tortures, realities that shape everyday life. This is a country where 12,000 to 30,000 political prisoners and prisoners of opinion rot in overcrowded, violent jails. A country where repression is organized by security forces that report to a handful of senior princes, out of the reach of an abrupt, arbitrary judicial system. A country where physical punishment, torture, and the threat thereof, and the absence of transparent and fair procedures are the alpha and omega of the judiciary and the ultima ratio of political acquiescence. Talking about the strategy towards the Shia minority, which is in open rebellion, essentially. And, I can't agree more. I think that's the most accurately written article about Saudi Arabia as it stands. They spend enormous amounts of money in order to whitewash their reputation all over the world. I go back to an article I wrote on the 8th of May when I quoted the now Crown Prince, who said, "How can I communicate with them while they prepare for the arrival of Mahdi al-Montazar?" Put up a photograph of him. And as I wrote in that article, reserves have been depleted from Abuja to Riyadh, from Luanda to Caracas, and in all the oil-producing capitals in the world. The OPEC go-go days of Sheikh Yamani, his prayer beads and Delphic pronouncements belong to yesteryear. Put up a photograph of him. In August 2015, I wrote the end is nigh for crude oil and oil producers from Caracas to Luanda, from Riyadh to Abuja. My point is that I think, war in Yemen is a distraction and completely the wrong thing to do. The Yemenis have seen off other people before. They're hardly going to capitulate here. It's a quagmire, and they're even looking as if they're having to withdraw from Syria. The Guardian has an article today: the Saudis don't care about Syria anymore. It's all Qatar for them. Syria is lost.